Greetings, everyone. Peter Maravellis here, hoping this finds you all doing well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to another installment in our winter event programming. This afternoon on City Lights Live, City Lights, in conjunction with Graywolf Press, celebrate the publication of the acclaimed novel Sterling Karat Gold by Isabel Waidner. It's the winner of the 2021 Goldsmiths Prize for Fiction, as well as finalist for the 2022 Orwell Prize for Political Fiction and the 2022 Republic of Consciousness Prize. Sterling Karat Gold is the North American introduction to a writer who's displayed great vision and a unique aesthetic prowess, someone that we've been watching for a while now here at City Lights. Isabel Waidner is a writer based in London. They are the author of Corey Fa Does Social Mobility, We Are Made of Diamond Stuff, and Gaudi Bubble. They are co-founder of the event series Queer Read This at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, and they teach at the School of English and Drama at Queen Mary University. Joining them this afternoon in conversation is Maxe Crandall. Maxe Crandall is a poet, playwright, and director. His acclaimed performance novel, The Nancy Reagan Collection, made the New York Public Library's best 10 poetry books of 2020, as well as LitHub's 65 favorite books of 2020, and was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award in transgender poetry. He's the author of the chapbooks Emoji for Share Heart and Together Men Make Paradigms, and is the founder of the theater company Beautiful Moments in Popular Culture. Professor Crandall is Associate Director of the Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Stanford University. Very, very honored to have them both with us here tonight. Before we begin, as is customary before each event, I'd like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. This afternoon's event is being co-sponsored by the fabulous Graywolf Press, a leading independent nonprofit publisher who since 1974 has been championing the cause of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and works in translation. We've had the pleasure of working with them for many decades and are delighted to have them back in the house once again, celebrating this remarkable new book and this amazing talent. So I'd like to remind everyone, we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Sterling Karat Silver, as well as books by Maxe Crandall. Also like to encourage everyone to switch to speaker view so as to enhance your viewing abilities. That can be done by the prompt in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom dashboard. That way you'll kind of avoid that Hollywood Squares effect. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to Isabel Waidner and Maxe Crandall. A great pleasure and an honor to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thanks all for being here. I know that Max isn't able to unmute himself. Peter, is there anything you can do to help?
Hi, I'm here.
Oh, yes. So to begin with, thanks all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, it's so fun to see so many friends here. And so good to see you, Isabel. Congratulations on the US publication. That was yesterday, right?
Yeah, that was yesterday.
And so people here, I have long been a huge fan of Isabel's writing, curating culture work, and so I'm thrilled to be in conversation today. I think I feel so much affinity for the work and so much overlap in terms of thinking about queer aesthetics, performance, politics, so much more. So we're excited to share some work today and get some questions and conversation from all of you. One thing before we start reading, Isabel, I think you know, when I first saw the announcement about your book, I was so jealous about the title, Sterling Karat Gold. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about Sterling and the title.
It's not even half as good as the Nancy Reagan collection, but which is the title of Max's book, for those of you who don't know. Yeah, I could say a little bit of very rarely, once, as a matter of fact, I start a book with a title, and this title I had first. So I simply had I had the title and build the book around the title. And there isn't that much of a connection other than that the main character is obviously called Sterling. Sterling obviously also signifying all sorts of glittery stuff, but also the British currency, pound sterling. So all of these elements sort of somehow resonate with the content of the novel, but generally speaking, it's just sort of a feel. It's just sort of the feel of something that's really, really bright and really, really glittery. And I think I sort of needed a title like that because I wrote it for the large part during 2020, which wasn't a bright year for any of us at all. So I had this to sort of hold on to, like a moment of optimism and a moment of brightness in a way.
Oh,
That's what I can say about the title.
Thank you. It captures so much about the book and the colors. And then of course it resounds and echoes as soon as you read the epigraph to the book from Samuel Delany. All good is about money.
Yeah, everything. I think exactly for those of you who haven't had the chance to look at the book, there's an epigraph in there called All Good Fiction is About Money from Samuel Delany, which interests me because money and finances are sort of bracketed out of so much of what counts as literature in a way. It kind of like social aspects like class, wealth, and so on and so forth. They're so often not even addressed in fiction, which is why this quote from Samuel Delany struck me so much. The fact that money is actually something that needs to fundamentally shape what happens in a novel. It shapes everything, sadly, in the world that we live in. Do you think?
I do, yeah, I do. And I think that's one thing that is so exciting about reading this book in particular is the way that you excavate and kind of raise content, subjects that are not usually positioned in literature in the novel form in this way. And I think it's so fun to read this book because, in some ways we never know what you're going to do next. But you don't just pull up, right, these issues, but the way that class, we'll get into this in a minute, but the way that class becomes a question of aesthetics, I think too, in this book is something that is just so brilliant and shiny on every page. And so I think that's a great kind of moment to say, like, let's hear a bit of that prose.
I'm going to read a little bit of I'm going to read sort of the earlier part of the second chapter of the book. For those of you, as I said, there will be many of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, given it only came out yesterday. So if I were to sum it up in a sentence, I would say it's a surreal inquiry into the really very real and felt effects of governmental control and state violence on queer people, trans people, working class people, and people of color. So it looks at some very serious issues, but it uses tons of surrealistic tropes in order to do so. Like, for example, you may have guessed there's like UFOs in there, there's time travel in there, there's weird bullfighters in there, and so on and so forth. But arguably, it's sort of uses these strategies in order to write very real experiences that are arguably shared by many of us. So the bit I'm going to read, just so you get a sense of what it's like, as I said, is from the second chapter. And the only thing you need to know is in the first chapter, the main character, Sterling, is attacked for no reason, no discernible reason, by a gang of bullfighters in the middle of London. So that's how the book opens. And the only other thing, and then Sterling is saved by some character called Rodney, who Sterling doesn't know yet at this point at all. The only other thing you need to know for this reading to make sense is that the other main character in the book is called Chachki, and Chachki is Sterling's best friend. And together they run this sort of DIY performance troupe called Cataclysmic Foibles. And that's all you need to know. So what happens here in the second chapter is that Sterling encounters somebody who says they're a time traveler. Having dropped Chachki off at their block, I continue walking up Delancey Street towards mine, and the exact same person, Chachki, or so it seems, who I dropped off seconds ago, is now walking towards me, talking and gesticulating with urgency. Not only is this Chachki, so-called, positioned impossibly in relation to where I just left them, they are dressed in an outfit entirely unfamiliar to me, namely a two-tone, cheap-looking two-tone polyester two-piece, second-hand car dealer style, and tassel loafers, which arguably counts as a look somewhere, New Jersey. They've got their hair sleeked into a center parting and unfairly are showcasing a neatly clipped pencil mustache, the likes of which I've been trying to grow for a decade, but haven't been able to, and more to the point, doesn't exist above Chachki's upper lip either, or it didn't seconds ago. And what's that smell? Is that eau de cologne? This Chachki in their two-tone two-piece, orange or purple, depending on the light's angle of incidence, is talking non-stop and inappropriately loudly in an effort to get my attention. But I'm sorry, I'm already listening to the staticky sound that their suit makes in motion. The clicking of their loafers on asphalt and la 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 la, the singing in my head, and yet I can hear Chachki Cheap Copy chatting at me, repeatedly saying about an important message they wish to convey, and get this, about the not too distant future, hence they hail. And if there was ever a point where I was following them, I'm now lost, metaphorically speaking. Literally, I just arrived outside my flat. I stop, throw caution to the wind, look pseudo Chachki straight in the eye and ask, what message? Chachki, second-hand car salesman, stresses that under no circumstances should I do what I'm planning on doing tomorrow, Saturday, but that I should put my not unfounded reservations about the police to one side and report what happened to me earlier today as a priority. They're referring to the bullfight, of course. Go police, they say, that is the message. I'm sorry, who are you? I say uncooperatively, and as a rule, I don't take instructions from strangers. But it's me, Chachki center parting insists, and I admit that there's a softness in their eyes that is vaguely familiar, alongside a mercilessness that is irreconcilably alien. It's this mercilessness, this determination beyond even the suit, the mustache, and the eau de cologne that renders them unrecognizable to me. I'm telling whoever this is that they are not Chachki, their blatant inhumaneness being just one of the many, many reasons I know that they are not Chachki, but an imposter and a charlatan. What's this now? They're pinging unsolicited photos to my phone depicting me and Chachki in unfamiliar scenarios, one shot against the backdrop mimicking Baghdad, and one featuring ancient superstructures in where? The Belizean rainforest, Chachki Sosi says. So I say as if and dream on. The furthest I'll travel is Forest Gate to the east, Forest Hill to the south, Westbourne Park to the west, and Glasgow to the north. I have never been a tourist or a global citizen or part of an international jet set at all. I've stayed put since first I arrived in London in 2001, perhaps to minimize travel costs, perhaps because all I've ever wanted was a home. Photoshopped, I say disparagingly, also nonchalantly, as if Chachki con artists' photos don't look impressively realistic and aren't getting to me. But they do look realistic and they are getting to me. I start deleting the images as they come in. I can't delete them quickly enough. Trash can, trash can, trash can, waste basket. While Chachki perfume counter keeps bombarding me with their unlikely photos and videos. There are short video clips of me looking disorientated in San Francisco. Never in my life have I been San Francisco. Are you sure you want to delete? Yes, I am sure. Delete already. But then phony Chachki pings over an image of Rodney and myself in a car park outside what looks like a North American mosque, and I hesitate. Not because of North America or the mosque, but because of Rodney, myself, and the unimaginable familiarity existing between us. Shall I leave it at that so we get to hear some other stuff as well?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's so good.
So this is a really crazy, you also get the sense that Sterling, whilst being like a nice and sort of a cool and I guess courageous person, is also a bit of a prat. So they're constantly making life difficult for their friends by not taking their advice and by not believing them. So they have a bit of a pratty streak about them as well.
And I love hearing that out loud, right? It's like the question of like, this is two simultaneously questions, like a question of like sameness and difference, that's kind of being like, this confrontation with the best friend who is not your best friend. And then the movement, right, of like, where am I? Why am I in San Francisco? And the mapping to the north, the south, it's place and time. And they are, you don't exactly collapse place and time, but it just like in the encounter, these questions of the real are presented through this really queer lens, right? Especially insofar as realness is always like a question when it comes to gender and sexuality. And it's so playful though.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the real is just such a surreal subject matter, really, isn't it? It's kind of, I think exactly, I think the book displaces sort of this sort of stable distinction between the real and the surreal in sort of many different ways.
And when
I think
I can't decide if like confronting a best friend that's not your best friend is like fun and fascinating and dreamy, or would it be kind of like a nightmare,
Yeah, completely. I think exactly. So I think as the book sort of develops, it turns out we kind of like gather that this person is actually the real Chachki traveling back from the future. So he is the real Chachki, but Sterling refuses to entertain the idea that they might be real. So they're also kind of defending defending against possibilities sometimes in a kind of not a very helpful way. I guess that's sort of where some of the humor comes from as well, I think.
Especially in terms of the narrative, when you have a protagonist that kind of wants to shut down the progression of the narrative in a way, right?
Yeah, that's
doesn't want to
yeah, that's true.
The narrative.
That's true.
Very, yeah, like
yeah.
It's very layered in that sense. Yeah. Ugh.
How shall we do it? Shall we do, because I wanted to some of you obviously will know Max's work, but for me it's really special to speak to Max because it's the first time we've known about each other's work for a long time, but it's the first time we get to speak to each other in the form of a public event. So it's a little bit like in my book in a way, so life and performance sort of begins to overlap or coincide even. And I wanted really, I wanted Max to read briefly from his work in progress as well, because as you will see, there are many sort of affinities and many synchronicities between our work. So I wondered whether you would be so kind and read a little bit from your work in progress, which I gather is a play which you're turning into a novel.
Thank you so much. I would love to. Yes, I started this project under lockdown. Some months in, I couldn't write for a long time when the pandemic started. And of course, we couldn't go to performance, and I was missing that. And I dug up the script from 2014 that I managed to get a fellowship at the Poetry Project with this project, but I never could get it to work as a play. And I was like, well, maybe I'll try to dust that thing off. And what happened instead was I started writing over the script and turning it into a novel. And I got really obsessed with that as a process and experimenting with that as a way to write. And so I'm going to read a little bit from this book. I think it's called Boccaccio on Ice. And the part I'm going to read for you today is from the middle. And what you need to know, it's about a soap opera called Steel Hearts, Steel. And the thing that's unique about the soap opera is that it's performed entirely on ice. So the actors wear ice skates. So here's a little bit. They've just found a woman who doesn't know who she is. We now return to Steel Hearts and the harrowing rescue of a nameless woman left to die on the ice. Cop and doctor skate up to the screaming ambulance at full speed. They pull off a hockey stop in perfect sync, allowing the gurney to fall between them. Their arms formulate an embrace around the metal cradle. As they begin to skate back toward the emergency room entrance, the wheels on the gurney wobble on the ice. There is a heave-ho, a recalibration of body weight to secure the motion toward. The actors inside cop and doctor both attempt to locate a certain elegance in the face of the failure of the wheel. Dr. Lastly asks in a characteristic clip, "Where was she found, Dick?" Cop Dick is a little jumpy, a slight slur on his breath, which is horrid. They found her on the ice just after the Zamboni plowed into her. Say she was hard to miss. In both minds, a complex yet basic image flashes: gore and femininity on ice, cold desire. They are still skating downstage toward the trick door. Dr. Lastly picks up the woman's limp wrist with his pincher fingers, lets it drop. His response is a simple camel spin, ironically executed in perfect stillness. In the lexicon of Steel Hearts, spins often indicate inner conflict, a manly trait useful in theater insofar as it assists in creating depth of character. The director of Steel Hearts, Maxe Crandall, considers the camel spin a steel motif and calls for it always with the refrain: "Butt out, arch your back, imagine a little string pulling your head up." Dr. Lastly says, finally, "Thank God, that man saved her life. Do you know who she is?" "No," says Cop Dick, "but she looks so familiar." Clinically speaking, that's because she is asleep. What's blank is recognizable. It's an old magician's trick. Dr. Lastly's family finds him to be a bit condescending. As with most doctors and people who, quote, "talk down to me," as the doctor's first daughter, Rachel, has said, condescension is a difficult subject for the doctor to grasp. "Now, Dick," Dr. Lastly begins. But before he can even start, the woman on the gurney groans. A groan can turn into a long dramatic yawn when one is returning from the deep sleep of physical ice trauma. As Maxe Crandall, the director, explained in rehearsal, it is at this moment that the woman's glacial pass from the ambulance is complete. Accordingly, the gurney wheel stops are activated, and mirroring light sound cues usher us into a new theatrical experience. There is a satisfying swell of string music and warm lights downstage overhead the gurney. The woman on the gurney's elaborate and ongoing awakening turns into speech. She says flatly, looking about for a mirror, not a prop mirror, merely a way to see herself, how her hair and makeup survive the slow roll of her entrance. Where am I? The doctor's voice finds a lower level the way that parking garages always have one more floor, either above or below. "Ma'am, you fell on the ice and a man saved your life." Finding no mirror, the woman on the gurney looks down the long slope of her legs under a warming blanket. "My feet, I can't move my feet." Cop Dick asks admiringly, "Is this a weighted blanket?" Sighing gently, Dr. Lastly pulls the sheet aside, not unlike a magician would. "That's because you're wearing heavy ice skates, ma'am." A woman's life is replete with moments like this, where she comes to know her true self again and again, deep within the utter mystery of her own mind. For Simone de Beauvoir, these moments are akin to being born again, as woman becomes herself cyclically, almost daily. As Maxe Crandall, the director, explained in rehearsal, this is why soap operas so often explore amnesiastic themes. Loops of unknowing present opportunities for ritualized self-becoming for the audience of women, gay men, and children at home. Blinking her eyes in some magical combination of disbelief and sheer luck, the woman asks the men, Am I some sort of skater? Don't you know who you are? The doctor implores. And so the narrative continues from there and gets intertwined with a story about how when I was in high school, I checked out the book, The Second Sex, from a local library. I grew up in Indiana. And someone, my sister's friend who I drove to school, saw the book in the back seat of my car. And well, this is kind of a spoiler alert, but it tells the story of how she outed me. She decided that me having that book meant that I was gay. And then she told her parents. And so it's a whole soap opera of my own life that kind of like comes into the scene. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hilarious as well. Yeah, great. I can't wait to read the book. So you see what I mean? There's like all this, what is an obvious overlap is that we're both working, we're writing novels about other performance practices, or that feature that they kind of like put to work other performance practices, like in my book, that sort of performance group, Cataclysmic Foibles. And in your book, is that Steel Hearts, soap opera, that sort of run, I guess, through the narrative.
I guess too, there's a way that the performance practice in both works turns into something else in the real world. And so again, I want to be very careful with spoilers today, but in some ways what happens, maybe I could say in your book that, you know, the performance series that Tchotchke and Sterling do on a semi-regular basis, as queer performance series are, winds up kind of becoming a mechanism of the law and the court system. And it's like truly fascinating how I think one theme in your book is really about the spectacles of power. And so writing about performance and having performance as this like activating force in the book, I just think you're able to really, well, I mean, that sounded like it's so obvious, but in a way, I think that you just bring kind of like these mechanisms of power. And like I say to my students, the structures of oppression become these like really active forces that are visibilized in your book.
That was exactly the idea. Exactly. I wanted to sort of really illustrate and kind of like mobilize differently, I guess, how some of the power structures work in this case in Britain, but I'm sure there's many overlaps to America as well. Exactly. So this is what I wanted to illustrate. I wanted to some extent illustrate how power might work, especially if you're on the receiving end, if you're on the powerless end. But in some ways, exactly. So I mean, I don't really think in my book you can really, because there isn't sort of like a big reveal at the end. I think it's fair to say that the scene that Max, I guess you were referring to, is like one of the performances, one of the Cataclysmic Foibles performances gets sort of co-opted by the state or whatever, by the powers that were, gets co-opted and is turned into a trial against Sterling, so to speak. But because it's Sterling and Tchotchke's performance group, they sort of keep a handle on things that they would not. They sort of keep they sort of have an agency. They sort of have agency in that scene that they might not have if it weren't taking place as part of their theater series. So whilst, yeah, okay, the state co-opts Cataclysmic Foibles momentarily in that sense, ultimately, and also towards the end, the sort of, in my book at least, and that's clearly the fantasy, or even like the revenge fantasy as it turns out, ultimately the performance group ends up more powerful than any of the sort of oppressive power structures that are sort of targeting the main characters in a way. Does that make sense? So yeah, yeah.
What's beautiful about that kind of power at the end, or that empowerment at the end, is all of the kind of the way that you set, to use like a theatrical term, like you set all of these different queer practices and strategies, you know, daily practices even, and these are the tools that allow them to have their revenge, or to fight back, right? Whether those tools are, you know, about, the book is so visual, it's so it's not cinematic to me, it's more like a painting or like a cartoon, but the book demonstrates so much, even in the part you read, right, about visuality, right? And that way that like queer people, marginalized people, people of color are so hyper visible in a way sometimes, but then also that people can use their invisibility as a strategy to undermine systems of power. So that, for example, is one of the strategies that I think is really dramatized, and like almost you kind of pay an homage to those strategies in the book.
I think this is exactly it, precisely. So it plays with ideas, like you say, of over visibility, but then, like you say, but sort of mobilizing invisibility in certain contexts as well, in order to subvert some of the existing hierarchies. Yeah, that is what I was trying to do. Exactly.
Okay, so where should we go next? We could talk about genre, we could talk about queer aesthetics. If people want to steer us in the chat, you can also start putting any questions you have.
Definitely. I think you can start, Chip, because given there's only a few of us, please chip in with your questions at any time as well. We can literally go anywhere from here. I just really briefly wanted to say hi, especially to the Graywolf people, Annie, Yuka, and Claire, and Marissa, and Carmen, I see here as well. So special thanks. I would love queer aesthetics.
Okay, queer aesthetics. I'll tell you what I was thinking about queer aesthetics. And yeah, I think I was thinking, you know, we were even kind of right before we got on here, I was thinking about aesthetics as a class issue, and the particular role of marginalized people in undermining the aesthetic order is one, you know, way to cast that. And then I also, in reading your book again this past week, was thinking about this really interesting thing that you do with queer aesthetics, which I think you really tie to time and temporality in such interesting ways, which is that's a little far afield, or maybe kind of like, but we'll see if we can get there. And then I think just what I think I described your book as hypercolor at one point, and that just the bright, you talked about that with the title, the brightness, the colors, and then, you know, the Chachki is a fashion student and costume designer. And so we get these really amazing descriptions of these surreal kind of costume outfits, you know, that to me, I recognize immediately as like, you know, something that like I would love, you know, when I was younger, you know, like the kind of little worlds of style that groups of friends come up with together. And so there's so many different ways to address this. So I wonder, yeah, like what you're thinking with queer aesthetics in the book, or if you want to pick
exactly.
up.
So I think exactly, definitely. I mean, I think there's in terms of content, in terms of what's going on, the book is hugely queer aesthetically, but also in terms of form. So exactly like you, it does what you already mentioned. It's sort of hyper colored and hyper bright, and that refers to that there's a lot going on at any one time, which is also arguably a queer aesthetic. It's always a bit too much, arguably, you know, but in my view, or in our view, potentially just right. there's a lot going on. People are talking about costumes. People are also talking about clothes. And like, I give you the British context a little bit. Like, you're not really meant to talk about money. You're also not really meant to talk about clothes too much. It's not particularly polite. It's a bit basic to talk about clothes and to talk about money. It's not really a done thing in a, say, in a middle-class environment, but also in the environment that is the British novel, especially. These are things that are sort of normally bracketed out. They seem to be a bit garish, seem to be a bit gay, seem to be a bit queer. And so I throw them in deliberately, twice as much of them, in order to sort of challenge some of the assumptions that readers might have, what belongs into a novel and what doesn't. So I think in a queer novel, lots of brightness, lots of life, lots of clothes, lots of money talk, lots of all of this stuff, in my view, belongs into a novel. And yeah, that's sort of what I would say is the queer, is sort of formally the queer aesthetic of my writing. That comes through, obviously, also the sort of various genre tradition that sort of fly into the plot, like, as we said, time travel, like UFOs. That arguably is also kind of like I would count that amongst the sort of devices that I use to create a queer aesthetic as well.
And then I'm thinking about queer aesthetics as a way to see the world, is a way that one sees the world. And so the surreality in your book, and a lot of like critics talk about that, or, you know, a lot of reviews, is at once that, right? And is experimental in terms of genre and what have you. But it's also a queer lens, right? Where like the bullfighters are the homophobes become bullfighters, right? Or, you know, the landscape of the world that one is in is presented in an aesthetic order that is like not real, but it's real, right? It's real for the marginalized, maybe.
Mm. Everything is heightened, I think. So some of the landscapes are, so exactly. So an incident that might be like a bullying incident is heightened by turning it into a bullfight. A landscape which is really pretty dire, like a British landscape, bits of it are set in Margate, in some sort of an imaginary detention center. Again, the landscape is completely sort of queered and elevated aesthetically by sort of like superimposing it with some painting by Hieronymus Bosch. So everything sort of gets a layer onto, like a layer of artifice onto it that sort of camps this thing up and sort of gaze it up a little bit, in my view. And that's also to sort of counteract this sort of tristeness that we so often exist in, and that we also encounter in literature often, you know, this sort of like a measured tonality, this sort of you know, really put together way of writing that traditionally
is clean.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, good. We have a question I think is right on point about, can you talk a little bit about your use of Google Maps as a time travel device?
Thank you for that question, Lisa. So basically, yeah, the UFOs work, the UFOs that appear in the novel, there are all sort of time travel machines as well, but really the original idea is that they're exactly working like Google Maps. So you can, under normal circumstances, in these spaceships, you can only move along the Google Street View arrows, for example. So you can't just fly around like in a sort of real imaginary spaceship. You're sort of tied to the grid of Google Street View. And of course, one of the functions of Google Street View is as well, there is a sort of a little time machine function in Google Street View, whereby you can click on a clock icon and it also shows you imagery from 4 months ago, shows you imagery from 8 months ago, and so on and so forth. You can go back incrementally. So Google Street View in a way works like it sort of spatially allows you to travel along a grid, a relatively comprehensive yet still limited grid. And temporally, it allows you to make these sort of jumps, depending on when the image was updated every 3-4 months. Google Street View imagery gets updated, so you can go travel back through various previous versions. So why this works like this is
Genius. Yeah,
is a good question. It is just it's sort of like a constraint, I guess, I imposed on the spaceship, because nothing ever works smoothly. Everything, this is sort of like in my experience, you know, even like the sort of godsend, the gifts that you receive in life, they're always sort of you have to work them quite hard to make them do what you want them to do, and the spaceships work like that. But yeah, it also allowed me to sort of tie in neatly, kind of like a little time traveling plot.
And I wonder, okay, so there's getting some good questions here, and it might be, I'm going to kind of fuse these questions together. So there's a question about strategies to subvert heteronormative currents permeating development of advanced technologies, like referring to the tech industry. And of course, San Francisco as the home of that empire in a way, or one home. And then the want of queer interventions, and then Carmen has a thought about queer futurity and speculative writing. And I kind of, you know, because we're at City Lights today, you know, San Francisco shows up in the book, and there's you know, travel, the spaceship comes to us in ways that I just got such a kick out of as a local. And maybe you could read from that section, and then we could dig into these questions.
You know what? I tried, because we talked about it earlier, I tried to find a bit to read about, but it doesn't quite work because it makes too many connections to the other, to the rest of the book. So I just really couldn't quite make it work, but I can tell readers about it. Maybe that'll work better. So the section Max is referring to is the group. There's a group in the end. There's a group of four people. They, or more to the point, one of them goes missing. So the other three are searching for the missing person at some point, and they're using this spaceship that can travel as well as time travel. And so one of the locations that they go to is San Francisco, and specifically, how do you even pronounce it? SF MoMA?
Yeah.
MoMA, yeah. So they go to MoMA because one of the characters they suspect is being held captive in there. So they go in this spaceship there, but because it's sort of got such rigid, it's got such strong limitations in terms of where it can go, they actually struggle to get into MoMA. They struggle to find the character that they've lost, the friend that they've lost. So they travel around on the grid, on the Street View grid, which is also the only, you know, this is how I have been to MoMA, yeah, through Google Street View. I've never been there in my real life. So same my characters, they have access to this place only along the Street View grid. And then eventually they end up like going back a couple of years or 2-3 years, because they think, okay, then for some reason that becomes apparent in the novel, they go back in time in San Francisco, and then they sort of have to camp out in that park that's outside MoMA for a little while before they then eventually get rescued from the park. From, you know, they sort of lose their spaceship and then they get it given back. So there's all sorts of stuff going on in San Francisco in that scene. But yeah.
It was, of course, when you kind of, there's like, it's not prophetic exactly, but there, as the world went on after you wrote the book, it just is so amazing because, you know, I think at the point I read it when it was published in the UK, SF MoMA had like completely betrayed local artists and had cut their film program, had and their legendary film stuff. They cut the platform Open Space, which had been directed by two amazing Bay Area poets, and you know, all this stuff. So the fact, like, I just feel like this like monolith, the way that kind of SF MoMA is this like monolith in the book or something. It's just like, it really works given.
That's so good. Yeah, but it's kind of like, yeah, okay, it seems prophetic, but the funny thing is you always see these things. You see how it's gonna happen, isn't it? You kind of sort of really imagine how in difficult, you know, in kind of difficult conditions, institutions become more conservative. So it's kind of like inevitable to some extent, sadly, or at least predictable. Not inevitable, maybe, but predictable.
Mm-hmm.
Should we have a quick look at the question? Oh yeah, the technology. I can't even answer that. That is so true. Technologies. The question was strategies to subvert heteronormative currents in permeating development of advanced technologies. I mean, the thing is, heteronormative currents are permeating everything, including technology, including science, including politics, including literally absolutely anything. So I don't know if I could possibly suggest strategies, but it's just, it's obviously, it's kind of baked into everything. And all we can always do is just try and resist and subvert in new and unexpected ways. But I guess that would have to be somebody working in the tech industry, I guess. And yeah, Annie says, if there's time, could you talk about your relationship with English as a second language? Yeah, I can really briefly say something about that. Yeah, it's really interesting. I sometimes these days forget that English is my second language, simply because I hardly get to speak German anymore. So I've come to Britain. I'm quite young, at the age of 20. And I've not left Britain very much in the intervening almost 30 years. So I've been here for a very, very long time. But yeah, it's obviously still my second language, German being my first. But I'm sure that my foreignness, as similarly as my, to a similar extent as my queerness, to a similar extent as my class position, all of these things have completely shaped this sort of writing style I've developed over the years. So definitely a really good question. But I've never written, I've written one novel in German, like my first one in my 20s, but my entire writing practice is built around English. So yeah, I feel like I've lost a lot of German. I don't even I don't speak it very often anymore. And when I go back these days, I feel alienated from German entirely, because the time I was familiar with that language, or that I lived in that language, is so long ago, 30 years ago. German has changed. So it feels weird. Yeah. Really good question, though.
Yeah, another new question. I wonder if you could talk about the novel's engagement with history and historical artifacts as well. I love how it engages with that along with our present/future.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I think I think, I mean, this sounds like a cliche thing to say, but I think if we're thinking about developing subversive strategies and so on and so forth, which partly is something that the novel is concerned with. It's like about coming up with ideas that sort of help us resist what's going on a little bit. I think you can't really do that in any serious way unless you consider the histories that that make up our present in a way. So yeah, I always in order to, whilst I'm in many ways primarily interested in the future, but this being an inclination of mine, I don't think you can even begin to understand, to imagine a different future unless you have an understanding of the past. And yeah, so this keeps flying in as well, like older histories, like for example, something that we haven't mentioned yet, and this won't be that interesting for you guys. There's a kind of a sports metaphor is running through it as well about football, but European football, you know, the thing, the ball with the, you know, that you kick around. It's different to American football anyway. So that sort of runs through it as well. And there's, for example, a history of one footballer I use as an example of some of the homophobic and racist discourses that are totally ingrained in that sports in Britain and Europe, and I'm sure it's similar in many sort of sports in America. These sorts of masculinities and kind of versions of nationalism that are sort of tied up with commercial sports. These sort of histories are flowing through the book a little bit as well, and are getting critiqued to some extent, but also mobilized again in different and arguably different ways. Soccer, exactly. Soccer. This is what I'm talking about. Thank you, Sailor.
I mean, the historical objects, right? Or maybe thinking more broadly about like the references in the book. And so, you know, people also are talking about how deeply, how much like there's just a cascade of references at any point, right? And you're looking at like, let's say Renaissance paintings that have like quote UFOs in them. You have this history of soccer and homophobia. I mean, and this is the excessiveness of the novel. But it struck me yesterday that when I looked at the referentiality of the book next to the mapping that you do with Google Maps, with London, you know, and really going through like there's a sense of like a street map in the book. And I was thinking about how another kind of like queer aesthetic or queer survival strategy is about mapping, you know, kind of various codes, or like knowing various codes is about kind of, what do I want to say? Like, oh, like lineage is an important thing, right? And kind of like that you activate that sports history almost in a way to like, for Sterling to like think about a certain form of like lineage that is like both sort of trans and queer in ways that I found like incredibly moving myself. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, except that I think like this all of these literary artistic references, right, are also doing a kind of like, in a very powerful way, a kind of mapping of one's world, just as a simple street map or Google map maps our world, you know.
100%. I really appreciated you recognizing that, because that's exactly what it does. So yeah, the referentiality, exactly, it works as a map. That's a really good word. It also acts as something that really roots the novel and all its surreal, you know, goings on. It really roots it and connects it to real life cultures and real life and actual reality, if you want to call it that. So yeah, that's really important in a way, and not just any reality, not some sort of generalized kind of not some sort of assumed general world that we all might share, because we don't. It sort of really maps out a very specific context that these characters exist in. Yeah, so the specificity is always really important to me in a way, and it's sort of, again, it goes against this assumption, you know, there's this the idea that novels should represent some universal truth. I really resist that kind of, I resist that sort of understanding of truth. I'm sure I'm trying to kind of represent something truthful and certainly something meaningful, but not this idea of some sort of generalized human experience that we can all tap into. I just don't really believe it. I think specificity is much more meaningful and insightful, and also paying attention to difference. We can only connect with each other if we sort of pay attention to each other's differences and even appreciate them.
Okay.
Yeah, just Chinese response. Yeah, exactly. Like your relationship with Chinese, I can imagine. Exactly.
So why did you pick SF MoMA in 2014? And I should also say, like, maybe we could kind of close by coming home to City Lights, which is, I know that you've been influenced by the new narrative literary movement of the Bay Area. And I know Dodie Bellamy blurbed your last book, I think, and you Kevin Killian in Sterling. Do you want to maybe talk about that?
I'm just a huge fan. That's all there is to it. I'm just a massive fan of Dodie's and Kevin's. I think there's I've not come across their new narrative writing until I was in my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of work was not taught or even available in bookshops. It wasn't around, certainly not when the internet wasn't quite as commonplace as it's now. So I had it took me quite a while to discover this work, and then it's kind of perfect because it's a queer avant-garde grassroots writing movement. I mean, to be honest, we haven't got one in the UK, nothing comparable whatsoever. And trust me, I looked. So it's only in more recent years that there's a bit of a queer and trans writing community that is growing now at the moment. But when I first started writing, sort of say in the late 90s, it was like a desert in terms of, yeah. So this has to do with the independent publishing sector being lagging behind what's happening in America. So the independent publishing has only really got off the ground in the UK in the last 10 years, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all held by the big 5 publishing houses prior to that, largely. So yeah,
well, I think for many of us here, we're very excited about the writing coming out of the UK right now, and it does it feels like an explosion from over here. So,
now it's all happening. There was nothing, and now it's all completely happening.
It must be really exciting.
It is actually. It's a really good time.
Yeah.
In London, is in Britain, Glasgow as well, for example. Yeah, it's happening. It's good. Oh, thank you guys so much. This is so good. I think Peter, we've reached an hour. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. So
Thank
good.
you, everyone, for being here and celebrating. Thank you, Isabel and Peter.
Well, thank you both for this lovely talk, Isabel, Max. It's been a great pleasure, and we're hoping to have you back in our orbit sooner than later, once again, someday, and then hopefully in store. We'll see. Gratitude also goes out to our friends at Graywolf for recognizing a good thing when they see it. Always great working with them. And of course, great seeing so many of them in the audience today. We have posted links in the chat with which you may purchase books. If you are in the hood, please come on down and pay us a visit. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open 7 days a week, Monday through Thursday, 11 to 8, and also Friday through Sunday, 11 to 9. We are slowly getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. We hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
And
you
next
so
year in
much.
person. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, guys.
Bye-bye.